In terms of an agenda, we are going to do a brief introduction. Hello, we're there now. We're going to look at each artist individually, and we're going to switch back and forth between our two organizations. And then finally, at the end, we're going to save about 10 minutes for Q&A. And we just ask that you hold your questions till the end in case we answer it. It could be that we've planned to answer it just as 2 or 3 minutes in the future. And finally, when we get to the Q&A portion, we'll tell you how to do that, but we're going to use the Q&A feature, which is different from the chat. But again, we'll come back to that later. As we've said in the beginning, we are recording this session. So as Frances mentioned, everything we say is confidential, but know that if it's in the chat to panelists and attendees, it will live in the internet somewhere. So just know that in advance. And then finally, I'm going to play about 3 videos in varying lengths. I'm also going to put in the link to the video in the chat in case we have any technical difficulties, but I hope not. Hopefully we'll have smooth sailing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my MoMA colleagues, Lisa and Frances. Want to kick it off?
Thank you so much. So, hi everyone again. Here's an image of MoMA. We are a museum, an institution that is in New York City, Manhattan, New York. And this is an image of the entryway to the museum on 53rd Street. If you didn't know, the museum was founded in 1929. And we have close to about, I think at this point, 200,000 artworks representing paintings, drawing, sculpture, photography, media, film. So we have lots of different media in our collection. And we've been collecting, or we have objects from the late 1880s all the way to the present time. I also included in the right-hand corner an image of our affiliate institution, which is MoMA PS1. It is actually a former school building in Long Island City, New York, in the borough of Queens. And I wanted to also include that because it was the first US art center established specifically to present contemporary art. And I just wanted to share this from their mission statement, which is that they're devoted to the most experimental, thought-provoking contemporary art, creating a space for creativity and uninhibited artistic exploration. So I just wanted to share that. So this is just a screenshot of our collection page. You're welcome. About 90,000 or so of the 200,000 objects are on the online collection. If you ever want to check it out from afar, we are open now. If you can't see us in person, you could check our artworks out online.
Lovely. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with Art21, Art21 is a nonprofit organization that has existed for over 20 years. And Lisa, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. And it's our mission to inspire a more creative world through the work and words of artists. We do that through a series of documentary films, including the long-running Art in the 21st Century, which airs every 2 years on PBS. If you haven't yet, season 10 premiered in the fall. We have 3 brand new episodes that you should absolutely watch and incorporate into your teaching. They're on London, Beijing, and the borderlands, which is the US-Mexico border. And next, I just want to point out the artists that have been featured in Art in the 21st Century and various other online films, both in terms of their own backgrounds, where they come from, the languages they speak, but also what they create. So if you're looking to do a unit on a painter, a cartoonist, a performance artist, there's someone for you if you just check out the roster. And finally, I will just call out, because I saw that there's quite a few of them in the audience today, we have a really vibrant program called Art21 Educators. So if you're looking to infuse more contemporary art into your teaching, I encourage you to check out that. I'll put it in the chat in just a moment. And that application is up until March 31st. We're going to be online this year because of COVID. But if you're interested, I encourage you to check it out. It's a great program. And with that, I'll go to our definition. Our number 1 term of the day is contemporary art. There are so many ways to define this that it's kind of crazy to put it in one line. But Art21 defines contemporary art as the work of artists who are living in the 21st century. So if you hit next, Lisa, it should pop up. It's like one of those fancy Googles. Yeah, there it goes. But there are many ways to define this. So Art21, again, is grounding it in art that's made after 2000. But that's not the only definition. So Lisa, you want to do the other
Sure.
stuff?
So if you come to the museum and go to the contemporary galleries on the 2nd floor at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in Midtown, you will see artworks that start in around 1970 and go to the present. So that's kind of the timing or the timeline distinction that the museum makes. But then I also mentioned PS1 and some of the the work that they're doing, which often is some of the most current work that's being done and created right now. But I also wanted to pose this because this is this conversation that, you know, Emma and I continue to have and other colleagues have about this idea of what is contemporary art. And a couple of years ago, we started an online course specifically called What is Contemporary Art? And I just thought it was really interesting that the curators who worked on this course started off the course by posing this question to each other. And then these are some of the responses that they came up with. So I just thought I'd share with you today, just this idea that it is an ongoing conversation and it isn't one single answer. And it's something that continues to be part of the narrative and the storytelling of the world around us. So I'm looking forward to really exploring everything we're going to explore in terms of the artist today, and also this idea of what is contemporary art as we do that. So. Oops. So next, we're going to talk about, hold please, get my notes here, who decides what stories are given prominence? So that's one of the questions we posed to you all. You probably saw it in the description, but tell us in the chat. We'd love to hear from you all right now what your thoughts are about this question. Who decides which stories are given prominence?
It's interesting that there's a lot of responses about power.
Academia, institutions, artists, social media, the most powerful and the most famous.
There's also a lot about systems and society, dominant cultures.
The most economically advantaged.
I like that several people, including Maya, have pointed out the media. And I think that's something that we don't talk about a lot. Who gets the article written about them, who is the social media post that goes viral, all of that is intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Museum directors, dominant culture. Right, so the artists do make, Jennifer was saying how the artists decide, but it also depends on money and power. Right, so are some organizations driven by artists as part of their mission, but then when it comes down to final decisions, who's making those?
Lourdes brought up an interesting point that are we talking only about institutions because street art plays a crucial role in equity of storytelling as well?
Collectors and auction houses, right? That's a big part of the conversation. Oh, I like that, Sophia. She says, educators decide whose stories to tell in the classroom. That's great. And our educator activists here. Great. Well, thank you everybody for answering all of that. So today we're going to focus on artists. That's who's going to be the stories that we're going to be hearing from. So with that, I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Frances.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And thank you everyone for your responses. And throughout this session, we're going to ask a few questions. We're going to ask you to keep putting some things in the chat. So please feel free to be as interactive as you'd like. We'd love this interaction. So as Lisa mentioned, for this session, Emma and I will be highlighting 3 artists whose work we find intriguing, and we think that they speak to a diverse audience. We'd also like to go beyond simply talking about identity politics, although identity politics isn't simple in its own right, but we'd like to explore these artists' approach to materials, concepts, perspectives on history and society and tradition. And another thing to note is that we feel that each of these artists are presenting their ideas and sharing their experiences, but should not be looked at as representatives of the whole culture from which they come. And the first artist that we'd like to talk about is Jack Whitten, who you see in this photograph. So Lisa, can we go to the next slide? I'd like to start, oh, there we go. I'd like to start by sharing this quote, which I'm gonna add to the chat right now. And basically, this quote was from an interview a couple of years ago when Jack Whitten was asked the question, what is the role of art and artists in the racial problems happening in America now? And this is his response. And I feel like his response to the question shows the complexity of the concepts in his work. And it's a good start for us to try to understand his process. Later on, we'll delve a little bit more into his biography. So I'll give you some time to just read this quote for yourself. And then Lisa, if we can go to the next slide, the quote is once again in the chat if you need to get back to it. So let's take some time to look at one of Jack Whitten's paintings titled Autopolis for Edouard Glissant. This is one of his largest paintings, which is just over 10 feet by 20 feet. There's a lot to see, so please take some time to look closely, zoom in if you can, and in the chat, please share something in this painting that sticks out to you, or what are some things that you notice? So again, in the chat, just type in something that you notice or something that sticks out to you. A poppy. Katrina says, looks like a map, looks like a gratitude emoji, subtle colors, purple.
I like that some people know how to put emojis in Zoom. I really liked the fish earlier. I'm always impressed with that.
And so there's a comparison to a Pollock also, looks like a map, looks like an aerial view, aerial cityscape, rocks, city. Yeah, there's a lot going on, but it's not quite clear just yet. A cross, snowflake. I think I can see that with the forms that are jutting out. Movement. Fireworks, rocks, a virus. Interesting. Particle collision. Yeah, so there's a lot of different responses and there's a lot of things that people are responding to. And what I'd like to do is, I like that idea of connection. What I'd like to do is I'd like to show you some details of this painting. And while we look at the details, I just want you to look at, how Whitten handled the materials. I know it's hard not seeing it in person, but we chose a couple of shots that you can look at just so you can see it up close. So once again, in these next two slides, I just want you to take a look at how the paint was handled by the artist. So let's go to the next slide. This is a detail of the upper left-hand corner. So I just want to give you some few seconds to look. Yes, and as you say, you start seeing broken clumps of mosaics, Chio says. Now let's go into the next slide. There you go. This is a detail of the lower center area. So once again, I'm going to give you a little bit of more context about this painting. As I mentioned, the title is Autopolis for Edouard Glissant. Autopolis is a Greek word for without place. And Edouard Glissant is a Martiniquais philosopher and poet who writes about multiculturalism, specifically in the Caribbean. Jack Whitten has made several paintings throughout his career that memorialize Black people who have made significant contributions to society. Whitten actually calls this a memorial painting. And in one instance, he says that about Edouard Glissant, I knew him personally. He understood this root stuff, finding other roots and directions, but he had a different concept, rhizomes. I'm going to give you some more context on that to see if we can find some more and see if we can understand the painting a little bit more. So Lisa, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Glissant, pictured in the lower right-hand corner, advocates the multiplicity of cultural identities in an individual and borrows the philosophical idea of rhizomes or rhizomatic ideas to expose the complexity of Creole identity. The rhizome is a plant that grows underground and has roots that grow around other roots. Glissant applies this idea to creolization where roots meet and share cultural bonds cultural bounds to form an identity. So a little bit more, the rhizome, illustrated in the upper right corner, is an enmeshed subterranean root system whose plant product appears self-contained and singular above the ground. Underneath the soil, it consists of a network of intertwined roots that no one can be freed from the other. And creolization, which I mentioned, is a result of relations between cultures or several elements resulting in different identities. So a little bit more about that, because I know it's a little bit heady, but rhizomatic thought is the principle behind what Glissant calls the poetics of relation, in which every identity is extended through a relationship with the other. In regards to the Caribbean, the rhizomes are composed of the same roots. However, these roots are produced different cultural growths, so not everything's the same, because the soil in which they have planted shaped them in different and unique ways. The unique shape of each rhizome is equally as important to the common origin of the roots. It proves that there's no single Black or diasporic experience. So now let's go to the next slide so we can see the whole painting again. So once again, about this painting, the artist says, it's a powerful concept for members of the African diaspora. Black identity has been linked to our not having a sense of place. The sense of place for us has been created through hard work involving all of our faculties of being. So now that I gave you some contextual information, and now you're looking at the painting, how do you think Whitten built these ideas into the paint? How do you think he built those ideas into the painting? And feel free to add those comments in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Francis. That was such a great foundation in this piece. And I think it can be so powerful for both all of us who love art and also our students to look at the artwork first before hearing from the artist. And that's what we're going to do today. So Francis gave us some really nice quotes from Whitten about his work. And we're lucky that Art21 made a film with the artist himself. And we're especially lucky because personally, I love the way that Whitten spoke. When you hear it, you're going to hear his cadence and hopefully you're going to fall in love with his voice just as much as I did. So we are going to watch a very short clip, about 7 minutes. But before I put it on, I just want to remind everyone that Art21 believes in active viewing. So what that means is that we hope you're never just putting on a film and then leaving the room. I know none of you would, but just in case. Active viewing means that perhaps you're having a conversation before you play the film, like we just did looking closely at one of Jack Whitten's work. Perhaps you're having a conversation prompting a question. You're playing the film, maybe you're pausing, checking for understanding, asking a further question, resuming the film, and then having a discussion afterward or adding on an activity. So for today and for our first work, we are going to consider the question, what experiences and individuals influenced Whitten's work? So Lisa, you can go to the next slide. I think it should pop up. Great. So while we watch this clip, again, it's about 7 minutes long. I want you to consider what experiences and individuals influenced his work. I'm also going to put it in the chat in case there are any problems, but I don't foresee them. So Lisa, if you want to stop sharing, great. So again, we're going to listen to about 7 minutes and then we'll come back together.
About ready to go. Each one of these carries information. It's compressed into each one. It relates so much to what's happening with modern technology, you know, bytes of information, bits, that kind of a thing. I can build anything I want to build. I'm not a narrative painter. I don't do the idea or the painting being the illustration of an idea. I don't do that. It's all about the materiality of the paint. I grew up in Bessemer, Alabama. Everything was segregated. Transportation, the buses, what I call American apartheid. I always did art, I always did painting since a kid, but it was not encouraged. The theory being that it's good for a hobby, but you couldn't make a living out of it. Lucky for me, I graduated with good grades. I went to Tuskegee. The idea was for me to be a doctor in the U.S. Air Force and a pilot. It was always in the back of my mind that I was an artist. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do artwork. Tuskegee did not have an art program, so I left Tuskegee to study art at Southern University. And that went well for a while, but I got involved politically with the demonstrations. We organized a big civil rights march that went from downtown Baton Rouge to the state office building. It was that march, what I experienced, is what drove me out of the South. After that march, which turned vicious and violent, that politically changed me forever. The fall of 1960, I took a Greyhound bus from New Orleans to take the test at Cooper Union, and I was accepted. I studied art, painting. It was a good thing, and it was tuition free. When I came to New York, some of the first people I met was Romeo Bearden, Norman Lewis, and Jacob Lawrence. And in 1960 in New York City, the scene was open. Billy Cooning would talk to you. I had a dialogue, what I call on both sides of the divide. I don't make a distinction between there being black, white, or whatever. I really don't. If they got information and my instincts tell me, boy, you got to meet that person. You got to find out what they're doing. You have to understand this stuff. I reach out. The young artist has to have something to react to. My first influence was Ashley Gorky. Nobody springs forth from the head of Zeus. That was my first influence. Early surrealism, figurative expressionism. It wasn't until the end of the 60s, though, that I made a drastic change toward more conceptual ideas that dealt with the materiality of paint. I removed all the spectrum color, made a big move to acrylic, restructured the studio, restructured my thinking about painting. I built a tool. I called it the developer. And with that tool, I could move large bodies of acrylic paint across the surface of the canvas. I call them slab paintings, S-L-A-B. It became a slab. I wanted a painting to exist as a single line, one gesture, 3 seconds. That's why I built that big tool. I spent 10 years working on that drawing board. 10 years, bent over, stooped down. I can't do that no more. There comes a time when the body will not accept that type of abuse, and it was abuse. The slab is what led me into the tessera. It's a chunk of acrylic that has been cut from a large slab of acrylic. My interest, of course, is always about how I can use it to direct the light. So with these surfaces, depending on how I place them, I can direct the light. You see how it changes? That painting came out of a lot of pain. I started that painting, and then I developed a serious illness. I spent a month in the hospital. So that knocked me on my ass. And that painting was a way of like hitting back. I'm not gonna let this shit defeat me, you know? It's one of the black monoliths. It's called 6 Kinky Strings for Chuck Berry. And that title comes from the fact that anybody know about the personality of Chuck Berry. He did some weird shit. The Black Monolith is a series of paintings I've been doing for a number of years now. It started back in early 80s. It's a black person who has contributed a lot to society. So I make it my business to memorialize those people. And I find that each one, I have to locate the essence of that person. That person becomes a symbol. And I build that into the paint.
Again, I didn't say at the beginning, but normally when I play a film, I like to warn everyone that I think of it as like an appetizer, that we're not going to watch the whole film, and hopefully you like it so much you will later on. But I love that so many folks were responding to the question in real time. You guys are on it. So our question before viewing was, what experiences and individuals influenced Whitten's work? And you were all so incredible pointing out just the real breadth that he talks about, both in terms of his own personal background, growing up in Alabama, going to university, his activism in Louisiana, moving to New York City, his art world figures, talks about Gorky, de Kooning, and influential Black writers, artists, and activists like Maya Angelou, Muhammad Ali, Ralph Ellison, so many. And I also really enjoyed how so many people pointed out the shots that the filmmaker chose. I think Lindsay pointed out that it was meditative. Francis did a great job showing us the static images, but I think it's so different to see them as close to 360 as we can, in a film, which I think is really, really enjoyable. We also get a window into his process. So both decades ago and in, just the recent past, his ties to science, as Francis told us, and his real habit for inventing, especially tools. We saw the developer, that big one that he moved, slabs of acrylic paint in 3 seconds, and then Tesserae, which he's using, closer to the moment we're in right now. I also want to point out for our teachers that are looking for connections immediately in the classroom, that Whitten is just bountiful in connections you could make. If you're looking to do a unit with a history or social studies teacher, you could easily collaborate with his work, talking about the civil rights movement and many other things. You could talk about materiality, tools, changing mediums, and finally influence. All artists find inspiration from fellow artists and the outside world, and Whitten's is really perfect work to consider it or begin that discussion. So you could go deeper by examining some of the people that he mentioned, or you could let students research what influences them, the people that they find inspirational. So yeah, lots of ways to expand upon Whitten's work. And with that, we're going to move on to another artist that is very deliberate in their choice of materials, and that's Doris Salcedo. So Salcedo was featured in season 5 of Art in the 21st Century, which is the Compassion episode. And this one, we're going to do a little differently than Whitten. We're going to dive into the film. We're going to hear a quick segment. It's just about 2 minutes. And then Francis is going to take it away. So while you're watching, I'd like you to consider the materials that she chooses and why. She's going to tell us. So it's not a trick. So again, we're going to think about what materials she chooses and why. So, there's some noise outside my apartment. Forgive me. So with that, I'm going to turn off my camera and I'm going to play, again, just 2 minutes.
I was researching several cases of people that had been disappeared. Finally, I focused on one case and I learned that in art, everything is particular, and the more particular and the more intimate you get, the more you can give in the piece. If I'm working with poor people, very poor people, there are minimum resources. So I limit my resources according to whichever testimony I'm working on. In Atrabiliarios, I had placed myself with minimum resources and working with the most despicable material you can think of, something that we all feel repelled by. Cow bladders on one hand, and old shoes. We don't like old shoes. But nevertheless, every time we see a shoe on the street, we wonder what happened there. So it's the wrong place for that shoe to be. I wanted to make that private pain into something public, because it is not a private problem, it is a social problem. That's why I made many niches in one space.
In the political realm of Colombia since 1948, there's been a period called the violence, la violencia, war, destruction, people being displaced, people so poor that they don't have any other option but get involved into narco traffic, all these bad things.
I was witness to this.
So again, a very quick clip to introduce Salcedo. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Francis.
All right. Yes, I know. I see that people want to hear more and see more about her work, but I promise I'm going to give you some more information. We're going to look at some more images. So Lisa, if we can switch the slide and next one. So once again, Emma, thank you for that clip. I mean, I can't not want to hear her speak, and I can't not want to see her work and the way she works with other people too. But you know, everyone just saw and heard Doris Salcedo talking about her choice of subject matter and her process. I'd like to delve further by looking closer at the piece that she was working on called Atrabiliarios, which is also called Atrabilius in English. Here's an installation view from MoMA when it was shown here in 2015, along with an untitled piece from her that's on the left side. Now, if we go to the next slide. So now looking closer, if you were to see this without the contextual information that you heard from the video, what would your reaction be upon seeing these shoes covered and recessed into the gallery walls? Or what questions might you have for the artist? So I want you to just keep that in mind. You can feel free to add some things in the chat, but I also want you to keep that in mind. And if you go to the next slide, here is again a close-up even more, because I think you really have to see this piece. And yeah, I'm sorry you can't see it in person, because there is just something about seeing it in person. So some of this information, you know, talking about the violencia in Colombia, you know, since the 80s, Salcedo has done extensive fieldwork and research in Colombia, speaking with those affected by political persecution and other conflicts. For this piece, the subject and materials are derived directly from the traumatic impact resulting from the Colombian Civil War. She says that her work is based on real experiences, from testimonials of victims and their loved ones. In the video you'll watch, she mentions working with limited resources. She also mentions these resources and materials that she works with as despicable. You heard her tone of voice when she talks about the cow bladders and old shoes. But she uses these as a way of communicating the stories and perspectives of the defeated people. Salcedo also collected these shoes from the families of the people who were affected. And these are mainly from women who have mysteriously disappeared from their homes. You know, these disappearances are a method of social control commonly placed in Colombia during the internal conflict between paramilitary and guerrilla forces in the 80s in Colombia. The title, Atrabiliarios, references the Latin expression atrabilis. Atrabilis describes the melancholy associated with mourning. After looking at the artwork images and hearing her speak about it, feel free to add this in the chat. How does she mourn the victims or bring into the present something that is no longer there through her work? So once again, you know, how does she mourn the victims or bring into the present something that's no longer there through her work? And I see that she gives them a voice. Looks like shoes from the Holocaust Museum. Yes, it looks like reliquaries. They're almost like relics that are frozen there in time and space. Now, just like with Jack Whitten and with the other artists, I'm going to share some quotes because I feel like it's always good when you can get a quote from the artist. And this one that is put in the chat, it's a quote about her role of what she refers to as a secondary witness. She says that her work is based on experiences that she lacks. You know, her work is made from indirect perspectives, from which a fragmented and incomplete history is precariously told and retold. Lisa Baco asked if they're all women's shoes. The ones in these pieces are mostly women's shoes, yes. So with that, I'm going to switch it back to Emma.
Thank you, Francis. And I like that a bunch of people put in the chat some questions about materials. We did just watch a brief clip from the episode of Art in the 21st Century that Salcedo was featured in, where she explained that it's cow bladders is the skin-like material, and behind that are old shoes. So you were correct in those two. Now, in the first iteration of this program, we talked quite a bit about reshaping narratives in museums in particular. And for further connection, we have actual footage of Salcedo talking about one of her museum pieces. Very brief context before we watch it. She's talking about the Tate Modern in London, which is, for those of you that don't know, typically Europe's most visited modern and contemporary art museum. And Tate Modern is famously housed in a former coal power station. And this particular project is in Turbine Hall. Turbine Hall makes sense. It's a former power station. They needed turbines, which is a very prestigious commission. And some other artists that have been selected to do this work include Louise Bourgeois, Olafur Eliasson, Ai Weiwei, and Kara Walker, whose Fons Americanus just closed, I think like a couple weeks ago. So while you're watching this clip, again, it's pretty quick, it's about 3 minutes long. I want you to think about, what does Salcedo think about this space? So what does she think about this very, prestigious, famous art museum? And what does this work, or how does this work reshape narratives? All right, so we're gonna do the same thing. I want you to think about that question, and we're gonna watch just about 3 minutes.
When I went to visit the space, before I thought of the piece, what struck me was the attitude of people that were walking in the space. Everybody looked up and they felt like it was an amazing space. And I was thinking, it's not that extraordinary. It's an industrial, modernist space. There are many, many more. It's not like you are entering Hagia Sophia or you're in front of the pyramids in Egypt. But people had that impression. And I thought it was unbelievably narcissistic. So what I wanted to do was to turn upside down that perspective. And instead of looking up, you have to look down as a way of seeing reality. So I wanted to inscribe in this modernist, rationalist building an image that was somehow chaotic and that marked a negative space. Because I believe there is a bottomless gap that divides humanity from inhumanity, or whites from non-whites. So I wanted to address that gap. And I thought that gap was mainly perceived in the history of modernity. When you read the history of modernity, it is narrated as an only European event. Nobody else participated in that. And the ideas of colonialism, of imperialism, are marginalized, to say the least. So I wanted this history of racism to come up, because I believe the history of racism, it's the untold dark side of the history of modernity. That's why I wanted this crack to break the building and to intrude in the building almost the same way a non-white immigrant intrudes in the sameness and consensus of white society. Shibboleth is a word that I took from Judges in the Bible. They describe this war between two Israeli tribes. The tribe that lost the war was attempting to cross the Jordan River to escape. And as they were crossing the river, they were requested to pronounce the word Shibboleth. They could not pronounce it like that, and they pronounced it Siboleth. At that point, the Bible described a huge massacre. 42,000 people were killed right there. So I used the word because I was referring to the experience of racism, of the experience of crossing borders, the experience of the immigrant. So what it is to die making this attempt at crossing a border. The word that defines my work is impotence. I am completely impotent. I feel that I am responsible for everything that happens and that I simply arrive too late. I cannot give anybody back their father or their son. I cannot fix any problem. I can do nothing. It's a lack of power. But then, as a person who lacks power, I face the ones who have power and who manipulate life. It's from that perspective of the one who lacks power that I look at the powerful ones and at their deeds.
So again, a very quick clip from Salcedo talking about her work at Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern in London. And I really appreciated that people were picking up so quickly in the chat the depth of Salcedo's work and how she was commenting, this idea of looking down instead of looking up, and bringing voices into the space that might not traditionally be allowed or welcomed into it. And I really liked that Sarah pointed out this idea that pronunciation could be a weapon, which is such a powerful statement, but exactly what Salcedo's commenting on, that she's really asking us to question these ideas of architecture and its value and the shaky ideological foundations of Western notions of modernity. Is the Tate Modern Turbine Hall that special? I don't know. I like the way that she spoke about it, that maybe it's not. And I think it's also really powerful how she's commenting on the long legacy of racism and colonialism when it relates to the modern world, and that this sibboleth is a custom, a phrase, or a use of language that acts as a test of belonging to a certain social group, and that there are, by definition, people that are not able to join that group. And she's really asking the viewer of the work to question their relationship to the piece, the museum, and each other, and particularly those that are excluded from museum spaces. And with that, Francis, do you want to tell us about our final artist?
Sure, be glad to. One thing that just seeing all these responses from people. A few people earlier had talked about that, these private sufferings are not just private, but they're not just private problems, but societal problems. So thank you for those of you who typed that in and picked up on that and saw what Salcedo was doing. So thank you. So with that, let's move into the final artist we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Shahzia Sikander and her works. And the last two artists we looked at, they pushed the boundaries of representation, materials exploration, and her takes on history and society. Now, with Shahzia, we're going to look at an artist who pushes the boundaries of tradition and art historical tropes. Shahzia Sikander is known for a practice that takes classical Indo-Persian miniature painting as its point of departure, and it flexes with it contemporary South Asian, American, feminist, and Muslim perspectives. Through her work, she asks that we understand terms such as tradition, culture, and identity as being unstable, abstract, and constantly evolving. Her works borrow and freely mix the imagery and styles linked to Hindu, Persian, Muslim, and Indian miniatures, and they frequently involve Western and modern references. And a lot of them are also personal experiences from her life as well. She chose to engage with and learn the traditional process of Indo-Persian miniature painting at a time when it wasn't popular. She said that modern artists, contemporary artists of that time, didn't really see it as something that's popular. She saw it as something that was kitsch, mainly for tourist consumption, and questions low versus high art, or illustration versus fine art, tradition versus the avant-garde. So now let's jump into some of her work. Lisa, if we can go to the next slide. This is an image of her thesis work, The Scroll, which she made in 1989 to 1990. She says that this was the first painting where she felt that she moved from student work to having her own artistic voice. The painting, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but we put some details on the bottom, depicts the daily life in a modern Pakistani home, specifically the home where she grew up in. There's a woman dressed in white who Sikander says represents herself as a floating, ghost-like presence who seems to float through the house. The perspective of the house has been distorted to show multiple viewpoints. Multiple times, and rooms. She goes on to say that she was making a statement on the ambiguity of youth, youth and the fragility of identity. It's hard to see from the slide, but the viewer never sees the figure's face as well. So let's go to the next slide. Here's an example of one of the styles or schools that she has drawn from, an Indo-Persian miniature from the 16th century. And just to reiterate that she says she forced herself to figure out how to quantify her distance from the tradition and to focus on her personal level of investigation. And on that note, I'm gonna give you a quote from her. So if we go to the next slide. I just love seeing artist quotes and reading them. So she said she's interested in taking a form, breaking it apart, and then rebuilding it. It's about transformation for me, whether it's the transformation of an image or a mark of a symbol, or transformation of a genre or transformation of a medium, which you see in her work, especially when you look into the next slide. On the left is one of her paintings called Turban Motion from MoMA's collection. And I figured it's good to show it in reference to the 16th century painting. So now let's go into the next slide. So here's a detail of Turban Motion. Looking closely, the painting features a figure amongst many turbans. And just so we're on the same page, a turban is the headdress worn chiefly in the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean and Southern Asia, consisting of a long cloth that is wrapped around the cap, as by Muslims, or directly around their head, as worn by Sikhs and Hindus. She says, the turban is an image which is already loaded. It's masculine, it's got race and religion. When it's flapping around, like she has moving around over here, it's like butterflies and fragile. And then it fits on, and all you see is a turban. She said she sees the forms in the work as being buoyant, floating, maybe in the temporary state of being, both static and moving at the same time. So you see that kind of parallel that she did with her painting the scroll. She also said that in the 90s, a lot of artists were working with identity politics. She says that she hates the word identity politics, but there was a prevailing multiculturalism going on in the 90s. She also said that the timing was perfect, was personally wonderful because there was such a focus on exploring identity. But ultimately, after September 11th, with the fall of towers here in New York, her work was limited to being seen and presented through the lens of her identity as a Pakistani and Muslim woman. After she moved and settled in New York later, she says it was the first place that she had been in her 3 or 4 years in the US where she wasn't seen through an acting lens, so she could be who she wanted to be. So just thinking about that, I feel like she has an acute understanding of the complex relationship between her homeland and adopted country. And while her work isn't overly political, the instability and flux of her imagery in some ways reflect the cultural tensions and misrepresentations between East and the West, as well as the potential for transformation, which she chooses to play around with. She continues to experiment with her process, transforming and building on the form of the miniature to suit her explorations and experimentations, leading her to work with video and the moving image, which I feel is a good transition to Emma for this part.
Thank you, Francis. And I always love to see an artwork up close before we start. And I loved those zoom ins that you showed. Those were really lovely. So we are going to hear from Sikander herself. Shahzia Sikander was first featured in Art in the 21st Century Season 1, way back in 2001 in the Spirituality episode. And then she's since been in several digital films. So there's a real like mini canon of her stuff on Art21's website if you want to dive in. We are going to watch just one piece that's about 4 minutes long. And just like Frances kind of cued in, she has been evolving through her process. So I'm going to put in the link in case we have any technical difficulties first. And then while you're watching, I want you to consider, how does Sikander's work evolve and how does she re-examine popular historical narratives? So again, we're going to watch just about 3-4 minutes and then we'll come back together.
I tend to look into cultural and political boundaries and explore, ideas in those boundaries. Sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes it's less. Sometimes it's more abstracted, sometimes it's far more illustrative of a political idea or thought. The last post plays on the sort of oscillating colonial trade relations between China and the East India Company at that time over opium. I started looking at the East India Company, and at the company man became like the protagonist who travels throughout India and then ventures into China. In this work, it is also referring to the end of the Anglo-Saxon hegemony over China. And there is a moment in the animation where the symbolic figure of the East India Company man sort of explodes. There are moments, I think, in the animation that embody some of these concepts, but it's not necessarily a linear narrative about this whole opium trade. Animations were quite a natural outcome to my process because I work in drawing primarily, and a lot of the drawings play with the idea of narrative, and movement was just a natural outcome. A lot of the murals that I did, a lot of the wall installations were fairly large and built in layers, and that also was very similar to how a lot of the animation work was constructed, which was in Photoshop in layers. So I'm interested in taking a form, breaking it apart, and then rebuilding it. It is about transformation for me, whether it is the transformation of an image or a mark or a symbol, or if it's a transformation of a genre or a transformation of a medium. But it is a very core notion that I think stabilizes my practice.
All right. Yeah, and that was real quick video just to hear a little bit more from Sikander. And I love that so many people were putting in the chat how her work evolved. And absolutely, she moved from painting and drawing to animation. And she seemed to, or she said quite eloquently that it was a natural evolution, that it made sense that movement had always been a part. We see that in this beautiful detail that Frances chose to actual animations. And furthermore, Sikander has a long history being trained in technical or traditional techniques, and she uses those to explore modern concepts. So in American schools, history is often taught with a very Eurocentric leaning. So her choice to have the East India Company man, a symbol of international trade and British Empire to some, and equally a symbol of violence and oppression to many, slowly shatter could be a metaphor for historical analysis through a multicultural lens. So I thought that was such a powerful moment when he just like kind of breaks like glass into the ether. And with that, I think it is so critical to, and I love that people were picking up on this in the chat, to showcase artists that are living today and that are exploring dominant narratives of various types. And as teachers, I just want to plug once more. I know it's late on a Tuesday for many of us, that especially if you're in charge of your own curriculum, you have so much power that the artists you choose to highlight really matter. And I hope that we've showed you some takeaways and points about each artist that can be used in your classroom. Frances, you want to add on?
No, you actually were very concise. And I was going to say the same thing, because I believe that in a chat earlier, we were talking about who decides whose voices or narratives are being spoken. And someone had mentioned that as an educator, we can do that. It's not just people of power, but, even especially now, we're not together physically, but virtually, we can take people from different places, from different times, and share that with, once again, from other people from different places and different times all over the world. So yeah.
Really fun how that worked out. Multiple perspectives all in the session, in the chat. It's really great. And I love that Dana pointed out that you can curate your classroom, and you absolutely can. The curators are not just in museums. You also have that power. So with that, Lisa, do you want to talk about this question? Oh no, we want to do Q&A, I think, first. So with that, we do have some time that we can take some questions. So there is a Q&A feature at the bottom, but if you have a question about something that we talked about, or maybe something that's just been percolating in your brain for a while, please let us know. Francis and I are able to hang out for a little while and take any questions. But let us know. Is Art21 Educators only for American teachers? I'll answer that very quickly. That no, we do take international teachers, but I will say that because this year is online, really the time zones are for people in North America. So if you are worried about waking up at like 1 a.m., maybe wait till we're in person again if you live somewhere else in the world. But if you don't mind that, then if you're in the NY time zone, look at the application. It's pretty robust. So if it's something you want to do, I'd say look now, because you have to make a little film about yourself. Do we really not have any questions? Maybe people are tired on a
Maybe it's a lot to take in. I know we gave a lot of context and we jumped in back and forth, but one thing that just for the sake of transparency, when Emma, Lisa, and I were thinking about artists, we were thinking about artists that that look at things from different perspectives, whose work continuously evolve, and who are also very reflective about their practice, but also their audience and the venues that they're shown in. So in case you were interested in our process of choosing the artists.
Yeah. Brianna has a question about, will the artist statements be available? We recorded this session and we hope to share it with you shortly. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to send everyone that registered and attended an email with links, resources, both from Art21 and MoMA. And I can try to put as many of the quotes as possible in that, so you can just have them ready to go.
Okay, I see this question from Nelly Bespalova Carter. And it's interesting because the question is, I wonder what would artists create if humans finally agree to be kind to each other? I mean, that remains to be seen, but also you should look into artists who are doing social practice work. There's a lot of artists who are using that work to make a positive change. So my answer to that is, we don't have to wait until everyone is kind to each other. We can make things so that it would help us be kind to each other.
Absolutely. Marjorie has a question of how often do we present these programs? And I'd say individually, Art21 and MoMA, I think I can speak for both of us, have a rolling calendar for online workshops. So if you're interested, I'd say sign up for our newsletters and we'll email you when new opportunities become available. But we did one between our Art21 and MoMA last October. So this is the second version of this program. And that goes to the question about how do we pick the artists? We just thought about who, had we not talked about when exploring this topic, who could fit in, and all the things that Francis said as well, that, we were trying to be really broad in who we selected. And also we picked our favorites. Jack Whitten's probably like one of my top recommendations. I love him so much. So anywhere I can fit him in. Just being really truthfully, I love Jack Whitten.
There was a lot of Jack Whitten love conversation going on.
And that piece is huge. If you get to see it, is it still up in MoMA?
It's still up, yeah.
It's huge. I mean, it's really powerful to see it. It's really big.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you see it in person, I typed it in the chat earlier, but he mentions the idea of the tesserae catching the light, that there is something when you walk around and you see it kind of sparkling depending on where you stand and how you move.
Absolutely, yeah. Really, so the colors move.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like someone else had a question. Will you be sharing the chat room? Yes. So if you sent your comment to panelists and attendees that we'll save, and that'll be available in the recording. If something was sent just to panelists, it disappears into the internet ether and we'll never see it again. It's maybe a good thing, I don't know.
There's Jacqueline Reedy has a question. How would you advise people who work with young children, preschoolers, about reshaping narratives? I would say just reading stories. I mean, fortunately, I think I can say this, but Shahzia Sikander is coming out with a children's book, and she's going to be working with family programs, and she's actually going to be reading it. But you know, there's artists. I'm going to give a shout out to an artist who's at Art21, who's not in MoMA's collection, but Christopher Myers. He's in their collection. He's the son of Walter Dean Myers, who's a very well-known Black American writer, children's book writer. But yeah, I'd say just dig around, look at different stories. You can even just find the search engine and say diverse children's stories, diverse artists. But there's a lot out there right now.
Yeah, and I will say that in case anyone didn't catch it, Jack Whitten does say S-H-I-T twice in that film. So if that's something that you can't have your students hear, you should just be conscious of what portion of the film you show. And I think, you know, young students absolutely can see Art21 films. You just need to pick the right, essentially time codes. That maybe it's that you play the film without sound, where they're just looking at an artist's work. Maybe you're playing like a minute clip. But just because so many of them talk about really heady things, like, you know, Francis told us all about, what is it, glissant? Like, we probably don't want to go there with 5-year-olds. Maybe you do, I don't know, maybe your 5-year-olds are really smart. Just be conscious of what you pick. Denise asked, how is tesserae created? My understanding is that it's like an industrial mosaic material now, and it's just acrylic that's been layered. So I actually Googled it because I was like, how do you buy it? You can buy it in a lot of places. You can buy it off like Etsy. There are different like craft stores that make it. It seems like it's just another industrial art supply, to the best of my nature. I don't know if Francis or Lisa, you have more to add on that.
Yeah, none I can think of at the moment. I'm sure after we log out. Oh wait. I remember.
Yeah, and I think someone was asking a question in the chat about Doris Salcedo and introducing Doris Salcedo to middle school students. And I actually think, you know, middle school students it's such a great age. I mean, I think there's so much that you can talk to them about. And I think, you know, as Emma and Francis have already sort of stated, but just to sort of restate it, I think as the role of being the teacher, I think we hope that you feel empowered to feel like you can present the material, sort of curating what you think is going to be the best way that it's going to connect with their students. Like when I think of Doris Salcedo and younger students, I'm thinking about memory and about connections to history. And obviously, you know, there's certain pieces of the story that you just want to be careful about how you present the information in sort of safe space. But I think as educators, you know your students so well. And I think just knowing where they're at, I don't think any of the topics should be shied away from. I think that cognitively they can understand. I think it's just a question of you feeling you know, empowered and comfortable with what pieces of information you want to share. So I wouldn't, you know, definitely not for middle school. I wouldn't shy away from.
Yeah, and definitely great points, Lisa. And one thing to add, especially for middle school, is you can touch on the idea of empathy, which is something that we talk a lot about, you know, and how she talks about being a secondary witness. You know, she's telling stories, and I'm sure that middle schoolers can relate to that.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add on, I agree with everything that you both said, that I don't believe in censorship. I think you can talk about anything with anyone. It just depends on what your school community is like and what your students are like, and that changes year to year. So knowing them, choosing what they can handle. And I'm a big fan of over preparing, like thinking about what is a question anyone could ask, you know, from the wildest points, and I want to have an answer. And, you know, I think Salcedo's work is absolutely doable for middle schoolers, but it just might take you time. Like that might be a longer unit to really explain what she's talking about, why she's talking about it, what our materials are. Almost every single facet of that's so important to understanding. So.
Agree.
Lovely. Any other questions we didn't answer? I think we got most of the ones in the chat. We kind of glopped some together because I think some were close.
So should I go to, do we want to talk about, revisit our question, or do we want to look at our next slide and talk about some other artists? What do we think?
I think let's go to the next slide, and then maybe we can, if there are any last questions, we can type them out or maybe say them at the very end.
Great. So we've presented these 3 artists to you tonight, but there's also other artists representative in both MoMA and Art21's collection that you could also work with. Maybe tell us in the chat. Here's 3: Ai Weiwei, Ellen Gallagher, and Katie Grannon. Are there other artists that are coming to mind for you all that you would like to connect to?
I love that Linda
Mark
said,
Bradford.
yeah.
Yeah, Mark Bradford's came up before as well. I agree.
And he's got a piece right now that's also on the same floor as a Jack Whitten piece. So if you, once again, a plug if you want to visit, you can see both Mark Bradford and Jack Whitten's work. William Kentridge, yes. Stephanie Sihuko, who was featured in the last one that Emma and Lisa talked about.
I hope you came, Anna. I hope you remember her from that. Or maybe just know Stephanie, which is great too.
Mm-hmm. Carrie James Marshall.
Diane, is that Mutu, Wangeshi Mutu, or Muta?
I like Brianna said Dahosa.
Julie Moretu.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Fred Wilson is also Patricia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
great one. Hamilton.
Betty Saar.
You all just had a Betty Saar exhibit, right? That was at MoMA.
We did.
Yeah.
That's so.
Great videos of Betty on our website.
Oh, like Sarah mixing Ellen Atsui in connection to Whitten with materiality.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
There's a great El Anasui Art21 film too, which
Yeah.
I'll find really quickly.
And you can mix it with social studies and trade and history.
Look at Francis, great. He's writing the lesson plan on the fly right now on a Tuesday. It's great.
David Hammonds. Popel. Jacob Lawrence. Yeah, so many great ideas.
Vic Muniz, yes.
And a lot of these artists that are mentioned between our webs are both our organizations, and I know there's tons of video content. We also have Art21 video content on our artwork pages at MoMA as well. We have that collaboration. So know that if you plug some of these names into our website, you'll get, oh, Wendy Red Star. She was on our list that we were thinking about before.
And we were supposed to have an in-person program where I was going to have a conversation with Wendy Red Star in the Dorothea Lange galleries, but the pandemic happened.
Didn't that just ruin all sorts of plans? Well, I love this list. I love that people are still adding. And again, we chose 3 today to highlight because, an hour and a half, 75 minutes is not a lot of time. But there's so many more, again, that we've just created a really fruitful list that I hope people will use in exploring this topic further with their students. And I just wanted to say a big thank you. Thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday and spending your time with us and giving such great energy in the chat. I love that everyone is still awake, depending on wherever you are in the world. It's impressive. It's hard to be on Zoom forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you to my colleagues. It's been great. Just watching as I was running all the slides, watching the conversation, I got to really go deep, and it was really, really wonderful. So thank you for sharing.